Good morning, everyone. Welcome again. It's Monday morning. How has that happened so quickly? I hope you've all had good weekends. It's Bailey and French. We're here on a Monday Live, as we are every 8:30 every Monday. Good to have you with us, Nicola. It would be great to introduce yourself in a minute, but great to have you with us. This is your first time on Bailey and French Live.
It is, thanks.
Yeah, welcome. And we've got a really good topic. So we've just been talking for a little bit around development conversations, what this really means, what this means for organizations, how do we bring it into the forefront. Monday Lives are all about, okay, what's a hot topic for people right now? How are we growing our organizations? What opportunities are there in our workplace right now? And what can we do about it this week? What little nuggets of information or little learning actions can we take away from today? We've only got half an hour. I feel like we could have talked for days about this specific topic. It's a really good one. But thank you for having us on. Do you want to just intro yourself just a little bit?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. Morning. So I'm Nicola Butcher. I'm a leadership coach and chartered organisational psychologist. So a lot of my remit is really partnering with organisations to help them be a lot more productive, people-focused and purposeful, and really using a lot of coaching interventions and training and development to support them on their way. I'm a massive advocate of using psychology. So I really love to use psychological models and evidence-based work with them.
Yeah, and what I love about some of your LinkedIn posts and things is just keeping it really simple and practical. And that's exactly what Bailey and French is all about. What's the latest research? How do we then kind of grapple the practicalities and simplify it a little bit so that people can bring it into their daily lives? So thank you for joining. It's really great to have you on. What do great development conversations look like? What's happening with organizations? What are you seeing? What's going on? Why are we talking about development conversations?
Great question, thanks. I think one of the things for me is really seeing the untapped opportunities around having good development conversations, around, and using a coaching approach across organizations. So a lot of the stories, the anecdotes, from what I'm hearing from clients are really centered around, people's lack of engagement, leaders, managers having to navigate the unknown, ambiguous situations. There's something around, people feeling, disempowered, people, navigating, mental health, high pressure situations. And with all of these situations and challenges, a lot of them can really be dealt with by managers, leaders, and organizations embracing better conversations and using a coaching approach.
And what are we talking about when we say coaching approach? So I know a lot of people probably listening to this will understand a little bit, maybe even had coaching. But what are you talking about when you're saying coaching and development conversations?
Yeah. So for me, it's all about taking a non-directive approach. For me, it's about really being there as a listening partner or a facilitator of learning. So really asking open questions, being very curious, and actually, stopping and listening and giving people that space to think for themselves and to reflect and to think and to really almost empower them to work through their own, to problem solve with you there. So it's really coming out from a directive approach, not telling them the answer, but actually being there and being empathetic and listening to what's going on.
Yeah, that word empathetic is something we're hearing an awful lot with clients at the moment. How do we build empathetic leadership? And maybe that ties into what you've just talked about there.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is centered around actually listening. I mean, to be honest, you can talk about empathy for, a long time. That there's so much there. But I think from what I'm seeing and hearing from clients, a lot of leaders, for them, they actually recognize when they reflect back, a lot of it comes from them maybe not having the mindset of really wanting to know or not really actively listening when they're in the conversation, and really just focusing on tasks without really taking stock of what's happening for their teams.
Yeah, and we see this a lot in the training, and even if you do the first step of listening, where you kind of go, tell me more, and you kind of get to the maybe kind of semi under the surface of things, but then you're not really going the extra mile to dig into that person and why they're thinking that way and what their worldview is Is that kind of some of the things that you've been working on with clients at the moment?
Yeah. A lot of it in terms of if I'm supporting organizations to upskill their leaders and managers around those coaching skills or those conversations, a chunk of it is really going into that mindset or seeing the cost benefit of taking a step back and not giving the answers. I think historically there's been maybe there's been that pressure on managers and leaders to think that they have to give the answer when they don't. It's much more powerful for them just to stop and ask an open question. So I mean, this has been going on for years. You have a conversation with managers in training, and some of the training is about, how do they build a motivating environment for their teams? And typically they'll say, "Oh, but I don't know what to do for this. Joe Blogs over here, or I don't know what to do, or maybe I should do this." And actually, a lot of the time, they just need to stop and think, "Well, I haven't actually asked my team members what they need, what their needs are, what their priorities are." So a lot of it sometimes is them coming out, take that pressure off themselves and think, actually, I'm better off having an open dialogue, giving that time to my team and asking that question. So just by stopping, listening and asking questions, it sounds so simple, but it's so hard in practice when there's so many habits and pressures systemically coming about.
Yeah, I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it? When you're under time pressure, that's when it immediately goes away because you go into task mode. I know myself as well. I can reflect on many a time where you go task first. You're trying to get something done, or you're rushing to your next meeting, or Zoom's the worst, or any kind of platform where you're in back-to-back meetings, and so you maybe rush to get the answer. When in actual fact, it's probably better to go, hey, let's stop this. Let me ask a question, and let's come back to this maybe at the end of the day, or to think about your reflections afterwards. That pausing is being quite important.
I think this is where I think it gets really juicy, because there's so many levels to it. And I a lot of my work, I get organizations to think about what's happening systemically across the organization, what's happening for managers and also the employees. Because if we're thinking about building a coaching culture, we really need to get all of those levels on board. And I think it's very easy to think about, what happens in that dynamic of a conversation between a manager and their employee. But actually, the organizational, the systemic challenges that are placed upon leaders and managers really needs to be looked at. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every organization has a very different mindset and buy into how helpful or powerful coaching is. There's compensation structures that vary across organizations. Leaders are appraised for very different behaviors. Some are widely appraised for role modeling a coaching approach. Others aren't. They're pulled along a different trajectory. So there's various systemic things that come into play and maybe put that bit of pressure or friction for managers who may want to maybe do more of the coaching and conversations. But I think slowly but surely, I think organizations are going further down that road. More and more organizations are looking at their performance management process and really looking at how we can have more on the job conversations, have more frequent check-ins rather than that end of year or 2 yearly performance management conversations. So I think slowly but surely that's starting to happen across organizations.
Yeah, we started to see a shift, didn't we? And certainly kind of the reinvention of performance management. There's a big Deloitte article 2015, and then kind of everything kind of slowed down a bit and people realized that it wasn't quite working or wasn't working the way that they thought it was. There's a big question around the way that we're coaching, and are we coaching in area of strength rather than coaching in area of weakness, and kind of looking at all the reasons why you're not performing rather than actually keeping the conversation very future focused and focused on things that give you energy for the future. Are you seeing any organization, you don't have to name names, but ones that you're working with, or just examples that you've seen of where this is going well, and maybe some of the kind of key levers as to why that's working better than maybe other companies is?
Yeah. For me, I think some of the organisations that are, showing that movement or are doing, better, I think are the ones where they have got leaders on board. They understand the why, they understand the cost benefit around taking this approach. And I think it comes down to the leader's mindset and their willingness to understand it, want to do it, and actually role model it. And almost, to be honest, they are like, culture carriers in the way that they are starting to use it and make some of these changes across the organization. So I think some of it is really from that buy-in, that sponsorship, and understanding. Because if I look at, for example, I talk to organizations about coaching skills training for leaders and managers, and you can train them up and get them to understand about active listening and the importance of conversations, and you are effectively skills building, but there is a mindset piece there as well. And I think a lot of that mindset piece is around seeing others and how they're benefiting from it, that leadership and that sponsorship piece as well.
Yeah, that role modeling piece and that kind of just encouraging and almost sitting in with teams and going, let's ask each other the questions. And we do a lot of work around action learning sets and kind of getting teams together to really discuss. And there's that awkward moment where everyone's asking coaching questions that aren't coaching questions, but it's fun. It's a good way to engage a group of people in building those skills in the moment and keeping it really relevant. Are there any other ways like that you're finding really are helping organizations to build that kind of culture?
Oh gosh, I can spend an eternity and talking about this.
I did say we could spend days talking about this topic.
Yes, I think that action learning is a really good piece in terms of getting them to focus on the practicalities and contextualize it to the organization. I think if we're looking at how organizations can go about creating that coaching culture, I think a lot of it is really being strategic and getting HR teams, L&D teams to focus on what their coaching strategy is and really aligning it to where the business is going. So, really almost jumping on the organizational priorities and strategy and seeing that alignment to get buy-in and sponsorship as well, and finding some of those key nuggets of stakeholders that are really engaged with that approach and using them as agents of change across the business. I think there's also that piece around, really good, solid coaching skills training for leaders and managers, and looking at how that plays out across different levels in the organization. Because I really feel that managers just don't get enough training in this area. And so when they don't have the confidence or they are nervous, they are fearful about a conversation going wrong, because that is the reality. We really need to upskill them a lot more, get them, really practicing a lot more. There's pieces around really just, taking stock of the landscape across the organization and seeing, what really is happening on the shop floor, because we can do all of this sponsorship and build this strategy out at the top, but what's the reality for managers? What's the reality for individuals across the business? So really checking out what their expectations are. What are the habits that you're seeing on the shop floor? Are they proactive in their learning? Is there a very strong learning culture in the organization, or is it very different? So I'm a massive advocate of just taking stock around what's happening across the organization and build and linking that in with that coaching strategy. And similarly, I think I'm a great believer in having a set line on the coaching budget as well. I think there's a lot that needs to go into that to really make sure you're kicking it off effectively, because you're going to need time, you're going to need resources. And the last one for me is really getting one, checking that landscape across the organization, and two, getting their understanding and buy-in to how we can make conversations work. So, how much time do we allow for conversations and reflections? Because there is that risk where managers say, well, I'm not, if I'm having a conversation or check-in with my team, that's not seen as productive work. It's not really recognised or valued. So there's something about, again, organisationally or systemically, how do we value conversations? How do we allow that time for people to reflect and to experiment or try something different on the back end of a conversation, and think about the resources and the infrastructure around that? So, I mean, yeah, as I say, there are a few things that popped in my head, but there's absolutely loads that you could do.
Yeah, I just personally listening to that kind of going, that resonates so much with so many of the conversations that we have right now around people's budget and how we're creating space for people, the time for people, how we're looking at the strategy as a broader concept to help people to have these more human conversations, right? And coaching is part of that conversation. But what you're doing there is really how do we do this across an organization, create that systemic change for people? It's quite powerful. And I'm sitting here listening and going, okay, so I can definitely see if an organization already has that learning culture or has that appetite for some of the kind of growth mindset, psychological safety. We're hearing it more and more, and it's becoming hot topics. What if you're not in that space? What's some of the real ROI data driven conversations that you're having to have to really make sure that people have that budget and make sure that it's part of the strategy? And, we're not just leaving it to one side. Are you having those conversations, or maybe you're not even experiencing that kind of pushback at the moment?
I think the biggest, there is a challenge, I think, from what I'm hearing in the HR community around, measurable data and how they're looking at that piece. I think the biggest gap or challenge that they're faced with is the time to really drive this, because there's a lot to do if you want to do it well, and that sponsorship at senior level, that's a massive, I think, blocker from what I'm hearing. And because there is not that sponsorship, it's not getting coaching, and the development conversations isn't getting the visibility it needs and deserves.
Yeah, and there's a big question at the moment, isn't there, around how do we create that visibility, that role modeling playing such an important part, but actually how do we do it, and how do we work with our internal communications teams and maybe even our internal marketing teams to make sure we share some of these amazing stories. And we've got channels now. This is the brilliant thing. We've got Teams, we've got Slack, we've got all of these ways that we can share some of it. Are you seeing people take advantage of maybe some of these new technologies to try and make it work? I know we're not talking about tech here, but just ways that we're creating that visibility, I suppose.
I think there is over the years, there's been a push on really using different communication campaigns to kind of get the message in, for sure. And I think, again, linked with that, more organizations or HR teams are leaning on some of the seniors to get involved on these communication tools, to send that message out, to add that weight and that gravitas to why these areas are important. But yeah, they are exploiting a lot more communication campaigns to get that interface with individuals.
Yeah, because it's becoming such a fundamental way of how we lead. I liked what you said earlier. Actually, it resonated quite well with definitely how even I feel sometimes. You don't know the answer, and to ask a question almost is quite a vulnerable thing to do, right? Because it's quite obvious that maybe you don't have the answer. And so asking a question maybe could be perceived as something as like you're covering up the fact that you don't know the answer. That's quite that could be quite an awkward thing for senior leaders who are supposedly meant to know all of the answers, right? How are you helping with that kind of vulnerability, psychological safety at the exec level to get that buy-in?
That's a really good point, actually. I think it comes down to the understanding and training around the coaching mindset and the philosophy of coaching, and in a way in which it's getting them to understand that it's in a way, not to say it crudely, it's not about them, but I guess they are there in a capacity of really empowering and upskilling their team. So I guess the focus really is under that coaching philosophy is that by them taking a step back and rather than asking a question rather than telling the answer or telling someone what to do, in the long term, they're really educating the team to navigate their own problems. And they're signaling a sign of respect to say, I trust you, you're capable, let's just work through this together. So, but in doing so, them still understanding the concept of psychological safety and how important it is in their conversations to not focus on well, obviously there is a focus on the content and what they're saying, but how they're actually behaving in those conversations. So a lot of it is them in that, I guess, that educational upskilling piece is that buy-in is the power of the coaching philosophy. It's saying to them, you know, it's not saying, or you're not signaling you don't know, you're saying you care more about listening to someone else rather than you imparting your opinion, so to speak.
Yeah, which is really important, whether you know it and know the answer or not. Actually, sometimes it's how do we, and a lot of clients come to us, you know, how do we foster this this culture of continuous improvement? Well, if you're not asking coaching questions, you're not really inviting the learning to take place. But again, it comes back to space and that time and that mindset and kind of having people to role model it. I come up with this stat, so this is quite cool. I looked at it just before we joined, but this was quite fascinating. And it was kind of around coaching regaining that attention. And maybe this points to the kind of so what here, right? But this was amazing to me that there was so many search results. So this was December 2021, according to LinkedIn, 314% growth from the year before. So people typing into LinkedIn, you know, searching for coaches, searching for what coaching means. And I thought that was quite powerful. So there is an appetite for this better way of being. And I guess the question is why? Why are people, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to use the remaining kind of 5 minutes just to go, well, why should people, what is it going to do to their everyday? What's going on there?
Wow, that is a really great question. I could tackle this in so many different avenues. This really comes down to a question that I sometimes say to people: what do you get with a coach that you can't do yourself? And for me, it's really having someone who can really attentively listen to you and really challenge and provoke you to think differently and to think beyond where you normally focus on. So in the context of, for example, career coaching, that has really, you know, really increased over the last few years. I think the climate with the pandemic has exacerbated everyone to reevaluate where they're at and what they need, and coupled with that, they don't get the career development conversations they want at work. So again, organisation is systemically, they don't get what they need. They want some attention on their career. Why don't they? I think we all do. And that landscape of people re-evaluating where they're at in their careers. And I think, for me, the value of a coach in that situation, it is an objective party. They're really, and if I think about my coaching style, I can be very, very challenging and provocative, and really push it back to someone and say, look, come on, what is going on with you? And not to that extent, but some really good questions that really push people to think, and to really, in a safe space, think through various options for them, which is not easy to do on your own, and it's really not easy to do with friends who always have an opinion, because, you know, it's really for you, it's really for that individual. It's so much more powerful for you to think on your own and to contextualize it for yourself, because you know your own life, your own career. And similarly, when I think about exec and leadership coaching, the landscape, you know, there's so much unpredictability, there's so much unknown for them, you know, there's just so much they just don't know. And, you know, no amount of reading a textbook is going to help them. But actually, by drawing on a coach and getting them to think for themselves and improve their problem solving, because when you have a coach, longer term, you are that bit more adept actually thinking through a problem yourself and working on it, and feeling almost that you have got the resource and the capability to deal with some of those challenges that are coming up, is much needed.
Yeah, and there's so much that you touched on there, and like you said, we could probably talk about this for ages. But the resilience and the productivity and the performance of the everyday, thinking outside the box, when we're talking about how do we grow our organizations, what's the impact on, how do we enter new markets and come up with new products and new service lines, or adapt the business a little bit because we're going to need to, there's new competitors entering the market, or whatever the business challenge is right now. Coaching allows you and allows people and allows teams, actually, if done correctly, the space to think outside the box and be really quite creative and innovative. And it's about creating that non-judgmental space, which is really tough to do, and just to really bounce around ideas. But I guess you've also touched on another angle, which is really interesting. We should probably come back to it. But around the career, so many people are really struggling with retention rates right now. And I wonder whether just having that one great development conversation could really have such a profound impact on the retention rate of an organization.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is where this is the challenge of what I'm seeing, because people are yearning out for conversations, for that time, that space with their managers, and they're not getting it. And ironically, they are going to career coaches. And if it was just if organizations could build up that community, then I think it will have a massive impact on not only retention, but even before we think about that retention level, just people's feeling of empowerment and autonomy would make such a difference. And people's feeling that they have got a voice, they are respected, they are recognized, and feeling that they are that bit more capable of problem solving and making their own decisions. I think if I think about levels below exco, or I imagine even on even at exco level, I think so many people will be that much stronger in making their own decisions just through coaching, because they're so used to being told what to do, or that directive approach that have so much more of an impact. So yes, obviously the harder criteria around retention and things like that and productivity are increased. And even if we think about how you extrapolate coaching skills to talking about your clients outside of your team, when you're engaging with your clients, has so much more of a stronger impact. And then all of the softer stuff around resilience, empowerment, problem solving, there's absolutely tons.
Well, and this is why it's such a hot topic right now. This is why so many organizations are looking at how they can build development conversations and coaching conversations into their growth strategy. And that's the whole point of having this conversation. And it's flown by, as it always does every week, with all the different topics. But it's amazing to see it's not just about the performance and the innovation side, the productivity side, but also we haven't even touched on the well-being side. When I feel listened to, or I feel like my voice is being heard and I feel like I belong, it plays into all kinds of well-being and kind of, yes, we touched on retention. We've touched on everything. Why aren't organizations doing this? If you're listening to this today and going, God, we need to do more on this, we really need to come reach out, come have a chat, because I think there's so much that you can do and quick wins that you can get for this year. Nicola, we're going to have to say goodbye. We've got to 9 o'clock. Is there one thing that you want people to take away? Is there a little snippet, a little nugget that you want to share with everyone before we leave?
Yes. Reevaluate your coaching across the organization and put it on your agenda for this year now. Put it on the agenda now.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. That's been an amazing conversation. Loads of really practical ideas. So I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for watching. Those of you who have been live, I again, as I normally do, I've ignored some of the questions coming through. I'm sorry, I just get involved in the conversation. I'll try and respond. And if you're watching a recording, thank you, and keep watching back to the other recordings. We've touched on some amazing topics. We've had some amazing guests. Nicola, you've been brilliant today. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
And have a good rest of the week.
Thank you, Angie.
Bye-bye.